The first thing Isolde felt was the cold. Cold beneath her palms where calluses used to be. Cold of iron spokes that had never known the damp heat of a running flank. Cold of a moonlit stone in a place where her bones remembered running. She screamed once, a sound that split velvet curtains and drew servants like moths. A raw, bright animal sound that made the Baron's jaw clench so hard his knuckles whitened. Victor Armand had always hated noise that wasn't his command. That night, the scream was a betrayal. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Isolde. His voice was a blade with velvet sleeves, sharp enough to cut, softened for polite drawing-room ears. He did not move to her chair. He never crossed the invisible ring of care that separated him from the daughter he had folded into air and exhibit. It was as if he could keep the wild inside her at bay by the distance of his footsteps. Servants milled, faces paling. The lady's nurse pressed a hand to Isolde's shoulder and murmured reassurances, as if the girl needed calming like a child with a tantrum. Isolde's scream had more truth than any of them wanted to tolerate. She had remembered, even if only for a breath, the way her ribs had filled with wolf air before the fall. Cassian Vale watched from the doorway, all long lines and contained power, as if he had been carved from the same winter that kept the manor's terraces frostbright. He had been in Blackridge only a week, installed by Victor like a measured bolt in the Baron's strategy. Enough presence to supervise, not so much as to threaten. Victor's instructions were precise. Tidy the rebellion at the edges, maintain routines, observe. Cassian's exile from Ironclaw was an embarrassment the Baron relished. He would parade the beta like a useful cautionary tale. What Victor did not wager on was the small, unarmored ways a human touch could rewrite a protocol. Isolde's hands gripped the armrests until her knuckles bled behind the silk. Her hair hung in a braid that had once been the color of the underfur of a young wolf. She had been marked early, given lessons in pack law and hunting songs, raised with the expectation of claws and command that would secure the Armand line. Before the injury, before the whisper of a curse, her wolf had been bright as comet. After, the world reduced to soft rooms and softer words. Her father called it preservation. The pack called it prudence. Isolde called it punishment. "You took a risk letting your daughter cry in front of guests," Victor said, cold enough that the servant who had opened the casement windows to let the night smell in swallowed. His gaze slid to Cassian like a measuring tool. "Make sure she is composed before the delegation arrives." "I will not have Blackridge reduced to spectacle." Cassian stepped forward, and the room drew a thin line between him and Victor, a tension like taut wire. He was younger than his exile suggested, only recently roughened by the North's harsher boards, but his hands were steady. He knelt to Isolde's level carefully, because the Baron's viewers were legion and because he had learned humility through hard lessons. "May I?" he asked. And his voice was the sort that had soothed injured wolves in winter dens, or so the old stories said. Isolde stared at him with eyes that had been too often measured, blue-clouded, bright with the memory of speed. "What do you know of composure, Beta?" she snapped, not unkindly, because sarcasm was armor, and she had learned her armor from the Baron himself. "I know how to stop a trembling thing from bleeding out," Cassian said. He reached for her hand with an economy of motion that respected the Baron and the girl both. When his fingers touched hers, there was a spark, not of heat. There was little of that in such chilled houses, but of recognition. Years in exile teach a man to read the skeleton of other people's wounds. Isolde's was old, layered with scab and shame, and yet underneath it pulsed a possible life. The Baron watched with his habitual appraisal, like a man accustomed to reassigning assets. "Healing is not our profession," he said. "We manage legacies." Isolde laughed, short, a dry sound. "Your legacies don't run. They're museums." Her chair creaked as she shifted, small rebellion enough to anger a man like Victor. Cassian felt that movement as if it were an echo on bone. Her refusal to settle entirely was a fault line that could be widened. He stayed where he knelt, offering small exercises the Baron had apparently not deemed useful. Aromatics carried from the herbery, a textured ball for the palm, songs that were not lullabies, but old hunting refrains hummed low. He spoke of scent the way a priest speaks of scripture, coaxing memory through the only language wolves and their offshoots could not refuse. Over dinner, Victor's plans spread like frost across the table. The blessing of Blackridge rested on careful alliances, blood partnerships, and marriages that stitched territories together so no rival alpha could thread a knife. Isolde sat at the head as if she were the meal rather than the hostess, her plate untouched. Baron Armand spoke plainly of an arrangement with the Morrow Alpha, a ceiling that would ensure peace for the next decade, but demanded a ceremonial submission. Isolde would be presented and accepted as a sign of unity. "It is a ritual, nothing more," Victor assured Cassian, though his hands trembled once over the goblet. "An exchange of symbols. She need not do more than be seen." Victor's gaze lingered on Isolde with a father's calculation so expertly cold it felt like cruelty. His love and his ambition braided into a single rope that bound his daughter to his will. For all his care, there was no thought of what Isolde might want, only of what the pack needed to survive under pressures that pressed like talons at the border. The Baron's certainty had always been his power. It was also his weakness. Cassian had been exiled for refusing a savage rite. The North's law demanded a brutal proving, and Cassian had pulled his hand away when a human loved one called his name in the snow. That refusal marked him as adulterated, a beta whose bloodline was compromised. He had returned with a wound that saw him as less of a model of terror and more of a man who had loved a human. In aristocratic circles, that is a scandal that rusts fast. Victor had named him useful. Others named him dangerous. Cassian, who had no appetite for the petty pageantry of allegiances, had come to Blackridge for reasons no one guessed. Healing, he told himself. He had come to give someone else the choice he had once been denied. Isolde watched him across the table, the angle of her head telling more than her words. She possessed the sharp generations of the Armand line, the tilt that measured threats, the inherited scorn for weakness. But there was a newness to her looks these days, a kind of hunger that the Baron interpreted as restoration to decorum. He did not see the true hunger. Isolde wanted to run, to feel the wet of river and the grit of earth under a running paw. She longed for decision and not delegation. She wanted to be allowed to be dangerous again. "You will stay in my house, Beta," Victor said finally, the decision a stone he tossed into everyone's water. "You will supervise her rehabilitation. You will keep to your quarters, and you will not interfere." He gave the words weight, hoping the weight alone would stabilize the future he had purchased with alliances and old pacts. Blackridge must not look weak. Cassian's mouth flattened. The word rehabilitation in that room meant training toward a performance, not toward safety. It meant molding Isolde into a symbol, a walking treaty. He tasted the Old North in that language and a rage like iron in his throat. He had given up place and name for love once. He would not recede into being a glossy instrument for another man's ambition. Yet, to defend Isolde openly against the Baron would be to draw lines the pack was not ready to cross. He chose instead to learn her rhythms, to map the secreted places in her mind where wolf songs lay like seeds. The first week was small revolutions. evening exercises that Victor derided as indulgence, the opening of curtains to let a sharpened moonlight in, the gentle sabotage of rules that had become prisons. Cassian taught Isolde to follow scent trails in the manor gardens, to move upper body by coaxing shoulders rather than by brute outer strength, to take small, dangerous risks that left her exhilarated rather than exhausted. She answered with barbed humor and a reluctance that was more a feather than a wall. Each time she allowed herself a hint of desire, a want to run, to howl, to stand, Victor listened as if it were the pack complaining. Rumors moved through the halls like wind. The Baron's plan with Morrow Alpha, the unusual choice of an exiled beta to tend the heir, the possibility that the girl's paralysis was not what the pack had been told. In the market and the footways of the servants, whispers bloom into truths faster than any central authority can clip them. Some said the injury had been a punishment for an illicit romance. Others said the wolf inside Isolde had been broken by a rival's curse. Cassian suspected something simpler and more dangerous. Grief reduces a shift as effectively as any blade. Larvae of grief, unaddressed, could calcify into paralysis of bone and spirit. Late one night, when the house had surrendered to its sleep, Isolde asked him a question that was not about therapy, but about life. "Why did you refuse?" He looked at the moon rising over Blackridge's armored trees and said, "Because she called me by my true name, and I could not answer with a blade." Isolde's laugh was soft then, a settling sound that made the air between them less brittle. "I would have killed for a human to call me by my true name," she whispered. Her wolf stirred at those words, a ghostly echo, and Cassian felt it, felt how the thing inside her recognized the possibility of being recognized. They were careful at first, as all who walk under the watchful eyes of an alpha must be. But small things became dangerous in their accumulation. Isolde leaning her head against Cassian's shoulder in the dark, a choice rather than a surrender. Cassian plucking a stray lock of hair from her brow with a gentleness that made her eyelids flutter. The Baron's house hummed with the possibility of scandal, because the most dangerous thing was not blood or bite, but choice. The pack's rules were meant to keep things predictable. A woman choosing herself, a beta refusing the role assigned to him. Those were errors that could topple kingdoms. On the fifth night of their secret smallness, a messenger came from the Morrow Alpha. The timing of their arrival, Victor announced, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, would be in a week. The ceremonial submission would take place with the moon at its fullest. "It will demonstrate stability," the Baron said. "It will show the pack that Blackridge does not fracture." He meant to bind the future with ritual. He did not know that rituals can be broken by living things, by a woman's claw finding purchase in her own throat, and by a beta's hands choosing the woman he loved over a title he had been given. Isolde stared at the invitation like a wound reopened. "They want to see me as a thing," she said, voice thin, "as something to hand over." Cassian's hand tightened on hers, a small defiance. He had no authority in this house, but the power of a steady presence. He would not promise her deliverance. He could not. What he could give was insistence, a refusal in practice to let her be reduced. "You will decide what you are," he said. It was an assertion that felt like a pledge. The Baron, oblivious to the smaller rebellions germinating in his halls, continued to arrange futures like chess pieces. He would have never imagined that the choice of a beta known for his soft heart would become the splinter that might crack his handhold on Blackridge. But power, Victor had learned in decades of rulership, was never as absolute as it felt in the moment you measured it. Isolde's scream, the night she remembered running, had already shifted something small and irretrievable in the household air, a fracture. How it widened depended on whether anyone chose to widen it for the sake of love, for the sake of being whole. The night Isolde almost shifted, the moon was a blade of hammered silver that threw the manor's long windows into sheets of light. She had wheeled herself out to the old service terraces where the stone steps rolled down toward the river. An order Cassian had quietly subverted, insisting the air and the spray might loosen something rigid inside her. Victor had said no to such exposure when he thought of optics. He would say nothing now because he trusted that the house could manage a throne of delicate things. He didn't think, as they did, that sometimes a wolf needs only a crack of open sky to remember how to breathe. They practiced there just after midnight. The servants closed their doors with a shushing hush, and the world beyond the walls lived in a different kind of pressure. The pack's complicated breathing, the distant calls of sentries, the river's patient hurry. Isolde sat in a chair that had once been custom-made for riding, its arms polished by craftsmen who never imagined it would hold more than a dainty hand. Cassian had brought rugs. The touch of plant fiber underfoot made him laugh when Victor wasn't around. And their scent work began simply. Pine from the larders, the iron tang of river rock, the old sweetness of barley. He made games of it, drawing scent paths with pieces of cloth, her face like a map that would not stay folded shut. At first, the games were a manner of passing time, a furtive reclamation of muscle memory. Then, in a moment like a held breath, Isolde tilted her head and the world shifted. A scent, small, almost laughable, bled into the air, the musk of a hunting dog that had visited the servants' wing. Her pupils widened, her fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. Beneath the polite skin of her hand, Cassian felt the tremor that spoke of a wolf waking. "Follow it," he murmured, not as an order, but a dare. He had learned the nuance of coaxing through exile. He knew when to push and when to let the animal lead. Isolde's face had become a battlefield between fear and craving. She began, throat closing. She had told herself for years that any desire to shift was a betrayal of the quiet life Victor had built for her. She had listened to the rumor that softness would become scandal and had believed it. Now, in the hush of the terrace, those rules seemed like cobwebs across a gusting opening. She moved first like a thing discovering a forgotten limb. Small flexes of wrist and shoulder blades lifting in a way that might have gone unnoticed by anyone but Cassian. He reached to support her, fingers entangling with hers in a way that had become, in these stolen hours, something steadier than any treaty. "Breathe," he said. "Let scent be a path, not a trap." Isolde closed her eyes. The muscles around her mouth quivered, and for a heartbeat the world was nothing but this tenuous, infinite possibility. The wind lifted her hair, and the terrace smelled like river glass. Her chest rose in ways it had not in years. Not fully, not the way a wolf fills with the idea of running, but enough to let a sound loose. It was not a wholly wolfish sound. It was an animal and a human shape folded together, a note that sat painfully in both worlds. For a flash, her hands were claws, pale and long. For an instant, the world reoriented. Cassian saw it, and his heart lurched, a combination of terror and a tenderness so vivid it hurt. He did not touch her face. He did not try to force her across the precipice. He let the moment exist, fragile and merciless, and watched the storm roll inside her. Then she recoiled. The muscles in her face tightened until they hurt. Her hands curled inward as if into a shell. The wildness vanished like smoke, and with it came a fierce dampness behind her eyes. Grief, not for the present, but for the life that might have been taken from her. She laughed once, an ugly, broken sound, and the world felt suddenly too small, too cruel. "Isolde," Cassian said, "that was, forgive me, beautiful." She looked at him almost with fury. "You would call my failure beautiful?" Her voice was brittle with defensiveness because everything at Blackridge had to be performance, and she suspected apology might be both her daily currency and her trap. "I would call it true," Cassian answered. He had not meant the word to hold confession, but it did. He wanted to tell her that he had been watching wolves in the north twice his age change in slower, shameful ways when someone cared enough to believe in them. He wanted to say he saw her, not as an exhibit, but as a living map of possibility. He had not intended to be so clear. The confession strained at the Baron's rules. Word of the Terra-session spread anyway. The manor was a looser organism than Victor believed. A maid smelled the scent cloths and made the error of telling another. Finally, the rumor arrived at Victor's breakfast like an accusation. "You allowed this?" Victor asked. His voice was a steel file. His anger was the sort that did not roar but froze the room. "Do you understand what a spectacle this could become? That a heritable—" He stopped himself because he'd promised the steward he would not use noble language in front of servants. "That my daughter's condition showing any variance could be leverage for our enemies." Cassian's jaw worked. He could see the logic from another vantage, the way Victor thought of people as strategic assets in a game that had rules by which one wins through attrition. But the logic did not thaw his refusal to bend. "Then hide her," he said quietly. "Hiding is not healing." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You are not from here, Beta. You haven't been raised in the slow courtesies that keep a pack stable. Your choices have consequences." The word beta carried in it all manner of scorn when used by aristocracy. Too human, too unruly, too capable of taking pity. "You would make consequences of her life?" Cassian asked. It was a dangerous question, sharpened by emotion. He understood the weight of words in a house that traded in lineage and alliances. He had been punished once for saying the wrong thing, a misstep that ended his status in Ironclaw. He braced for the fallout. Victor's face was a mask that hid the man who loved in the only way he understood, through preservation and calculation. "I will do what secures the future of the pack," he said. "You will do what I instruct." What the Baron did not know, and what Cassian slowly pursued through careful conversation and gentle defiance, was that Isolde's paralysis had been braided with politics more than with fate. In the months before the accident, Isolde had been involved in a scandalous liaison with a traveling emissary, an act of rebellion that would have undone an alliance Victor had been negotiating. The night of her fall, she had been chased through the freezing underbrush by men who wanted to drag her to safety and men who wanted to ensure her silence. In the chaos, a stone, a slip, a whiplash, no curse, no deliberate malice, only a cruel knot of events that broke a woman's confidence and her body all at once. Cassian discovered these pieces in whispered confessions, in a letter found under a loose board in Isolde's room, in a servant's tearful memory. The details did not absolve Victor of his choices, but they revealed the lies the household had wrapped around the truth. Victor had chosen to preserve the appearance of control by keeping Isolde small, by curating her life as if she were a spectacle to display rather than a person to listen to. And by refusing to allow her to exercise the wildness inside her, he had ensured she would not be a candidate for the thing she longed for most, being a whole wolf again. It made Victor more desperate, not less. When he believed the Morrow Alpha expected ceremony for the sealing alliance, an act that would display Blackridge's stability, his plans hardened. He forgot that the world could not be bound entirely by rituals. People moved like rivers and carved new banks without permission. Isolde felt the tightening of the pack's attention at her shoulders. Where Cassian brought herbs and small victories, Victor brought rules and watchers. The balance between them made her dizzy. She wanted to push back against both, against the Baron who would make her a pawn, and against the Beta who felt like a shepherd trying to domesticate what he had no right to hold. But she also wanted to allow someone to see her and to be present while she tried to remember who she had been. One afternoon, as she practiced the slow, awkward movement of leaning into the right muscle to stand, she overheard two kitchen boys arguing. "They say the morrow will bring their own enforcers," one whispered, as if secrecy were a shield. "If Black Ridge looks weak, they'll steal the borderlands while Baron Armand bows." The word enforcers dropped like a rock in Isolde's chest. The alliance had always been a thing of appearance, a bond made in stately rooms and whispered promises. But if the Morrow Alpha intended to bring force, if the ceremonial submission would become a pretext for power seizure, then the stakes were no longer merely personal. They were territorial, national, blood in the snow. She kept this knowledge to herself, the way one hides a bruise. Revealing it would mean forcing Victor into a decision that could lead to war. She could not trust the Baron to make the right choice. His instinct was to secure his legacy at any cost. That knowledge made her brittle with fear and furious in equal measure. Cassia noticed her shift when she would not hold his gaze. "You hide things like wolves tuck wounds," he said, softly. "Tell me." She looked at him as if he were a stranger who had stepped too close to a live ember. "If the morrow brings muscle, and if my being paraded is how they begin to take what they want, what then? Would you stand and be used, or would you strike?" He felt the question like a challenge against the grain of who he thought himself to be. The North's rights, the Ironclaw's customs, the exile, they had conditioned him to choose self-preservation. But in the small hours of the terrace, where the moon had almost stolen Isolde's control, something inside him had changed. "I would not be used," he said, "and I would not stand while someone else was used." She laughed, incredulous and a little broken. "Words, they have ruined my life." "Words can save you," he countered. His voice had a conviction that trembled with risk. "I will not let anyone make you a ritual." "You would defend me." She looked at him like a woman who had been given a dangerous gift. "You would risk your exile, your place, for me?" Cassian's answer was not a perfect oath. It was a shape of possibility he offered, one that might demand everything. "I do not know if I would win," he said. "I only know that I cannot watch a wolf I love be bartered away." For a moment, the world narrowed to the two of them and the breath between them. It was not yet love in the violet-lit, consummated way one reads in ballads. It was a coalescing of loyalty and urgency, of two exiles, one social, one spiritual, finding a small mutual gravity. It was dangerous because it required open defiance of Victor, and because, in a society that ate weakness for breakfast and gave trophies to those who never felt compassion, compassion was a scandal. Weeks blurred into a pattern of small victories and mounting fears. Isolde's mobility increased in small increments. She could lean forward and stand for a moment, then sit, then stand longer. Her wolf's memory was not linear. It was a palimpsest of grief and animal recall. The more she practiced, the more she wanted to test the boundaries. Sooner, too soon, perhaps, but the longing for a full shift was a hunger that ate rules and made a mockery of patience. And all the while, Victor sharpened his plans. He began to speak of the Morrow Alpha like a suitor offering stability, not as the threat he might become if gifted the wrong impression. He tightened house rules: no late terraces, no unauthorized scent work, no unscheduled visitors. He paraded a false calm that barely hid the tremor in his hands. In private, he watched Isolde with a man's fierce paternal love braided into a ruler's fear. He believed he was protecting the pack. If she was frightened by his choices, he translated that fear as a sign of the house's success in making her dependent. The announcement that the Morrow Alpha's delegation would arrive ahead of the moon framed everyone like characters in a play. Isolde felt the trap closing. For once, the future was not negotiable. The ceremony would be real, the submission orchestrated, and the Marrow's men could smell weakness. A week to prepare was a week in which tempers could ignite, and in which Cassian would have to decide whether his promise, fragile and unproven, would become action. He found himself aging as the deadline moved closer. He sat alone one night and stared at his hands, thinking of the human who had called his true name in a snowstorm, and the life he had given up. He thought of Isolde's almost shift and the small ways he had come to want her, not as a charge, but as a person who might stand beside him in a world that had not forgiven him for loving the wrong way. He forgave himself for that want, and in that forgiveness he felt something like courage bloom. Then the Baron called him into the study and spoke like an alpha who still believed authority could hold all. "You are my guest and my instrument, Beta," Victor said. "You will follow orders. If you cause scandal, I will exile you further. If you disobey, I will tell the pack the truth of why you were banished and ensure there is no future for you here." Cassian swallowed the answer he wanted to give, a string of defiant, destructive things, and instead he said, simply, "Isolde will not be given." Victor's laugh was a short thing. "Very well. Let us see who keeps their word, then." That night, as the house settled into the false comfort of preparation, Isolde slid into Cassian's quarters with the furtiveness of one who had long frayed courage. She pressed the side of her face against his chest and listened to the irregular drum of his heart. "If you leave me," she whispered, "I will never forgive you." "If I leave you," he said, the vow heavy and real, "I will not forgive myself." They did not speak of the larger war, of the morrow's possible arrival, and the way Victor's alliances might be binding them into chains. They only held one another, two people perched on the edge of choice, and for a few hours the world was only that room, the moonlight that filtered through the curtains, and the knowledge that the coming week would demand a shape of bravery they had not yet had to claim. The week unraveled like a rope being pulled through hungry hands. Each morning the manor felt smaller. Each night larger forces pressed at its walls. Rumors threaded faster now, and with them came the first visible cracks. Servants who once kept their faces blank now watched the hallways with the caution of those who have seen knives flash where none should be. Hunters who had trusted Victor's iron grew quieter at the edge of the forests, as if listening for a change in the air. The story of Isolde's near shift had turned from a private miracle into a liability no one could afford to ignore. The more Cassian and Isolde repaired small things, the more the household seemed to scramble to plaster over what they could not control. It was a steward's mistake that birthed the first true fracture. Old Marta, who had been Victor's nurse before she'd been anyone's, and who knew more secrets by the weight of her years than she ever let on, found a folded packet tucked behind a ledger in the Baron's study. The paper inside was brittle and smelled faintly of smoke, vocations of the kind men wrote when they thought no one read them. It contained Victor's signatures, the ink curling with a certainty that meant he had long ago decided the shape of the future. Isolde saw Marta enter the nursery with the papers in her apron, hands shaking. There was a second when the old woman looked at Isolde and could have chosen discretion, and then, as if a fault line had finally reached the surface and the old woman's conscience needed air, she did what servants rarely did. She spoke. "It says here," Marta whispered, voice like a broken bell, "you were promised a way in trade if you were rendered benign." The morrow asked for assurance. He wished for a spectacle, and the Baron guaranteed one. He signed iron and salt. He meant to give you as proof of steadiness. Isolde's chair trembled with the betrayal, small shakes that felt like earthquakes. The words unspooled inside her like a trap springing. Promised away. Spectacle. Guarantees made with the smooth cruelty of men who believed their daughters and their people were things to be counted. Her breath hitched. That old, scabbed grief bled again. She did not shout. The Armand blood made her too practiced in the language of control. Instead, she folded inward, a cold, collapsing silence that made even Marta step back as if struck. Cassian, who had been in the corridor listening with a careful ear for such tremors, felt his world tilt. He had suspected manipulation, had felt the Baron's hands on his life, but to see the proof in a trembling steward's palm, words inked to sell a daughter, was a cruelty that seared. They confronted Victor in the study. Isolde pushed herself into the room with more force than she had felt in months. Muscle memory and sheer will gave a man in creased robes reason to step aside. She laid Marta's hands on the table and did not let Victor speak first. He stared at the papers with an expression the world had taught him to reserve for unwanted news, as if the certainty of his plans had been stolen by a prank. "You promised me," Isolde said, the sentence a blade she had learned to wield in drawing rooms. "You promised me to a man who will parade me if I am weak. You wrote my life in ink and sold it like land." Victor's face did not flinch. He was the Baron, born to decide and trained to be ruthless. But there was a tremor in his voice that had nothing to do with politics. "I did what a leader must," he said at last. "I secured the future." "You call selling your child the future?" Her laughter came like a cracked bell. "You call betrayal a security plan?" The room split open when Marta, a woman who had once swaddled Victor's own children, spoke up, and her words cut through his practiced shield. "You kept the truth, my lord. You kept your own lies. You said you preserved her, but you chained her. I will not be the one who lies in my old age." Victor slammed his fist on the table. The sound echoed like thunder in a house used to command. "You will not shame me in my house, woman." Marta's eyes did not leave his. "You already have shame, my lord. You sew it into the sheets." The servants had always been the pack's shadow, watchful, silent, the quiet backbone that carried rumor to rumor until truth and fiction braided into the same rope. Now they watched with the faces of witnesses. For the first time, Victor saw the human cost of his iron laws reflected in the steady gaze of the people who kept his life clean. The weight of their watching was sharper than any outsider's insult. Cassian stepped forward then, the movement a measured thing that felt like a declaration. He had 100 reasons to be silent. Fear of exile renewed, the practical knowledge of how easily the pack's politics could flatten him. But the sight of Isolde's face, raw and brilliantly honest, forced him past self-preservation. "He signed with the marrow," he said quietly, to Victor and to the room and to all the long-held agreements that had lied to everyone. "You promised her as token." Victor's eyes flicked to Isolde and then to Cassian. "You were assigned to supervise her. Your place is to obey Black Ridge law." "My place," Cassian answered, "is not to be your instrument." There was a line in his voice that carried all the hours he had spent learning how to be less than what he was. "I did not come here to oversee her sale. I came here to give someone a chance she was denied." The Baron's face shifted. For a heartbeat, he looked less like a ruler than like a man who had married himself to a system and could not remember why. Then he hardened. "You make accusations," he said. "You defile the house." Words were weapons in aristocratic circles, and Victor wielded them with a practiced cruelty. The accusation that anything about his management of his daughter had been mercenary was poison. To the pack, the leader must be inviolate. To be human in action was to invite erosion. That evening, the house was a pressure cooker of ugly alliances. Some servants chose Victor's safety. They feared the Marrow's men and the consequences of a fractured front. Others chose their conscience, whispering among themselves that the Baron had long ago corrupted the idea of stewardship into ownership. The plots of the house, its literal and metaphorical underbellies, teemed with discontent. And in the corridors, among the ivy and the framed portraits of stern ancestors, resentment became strategy. Isolde felt the fractures most intimately in the people she had thought had been her allies. Her nurse, a woman who had cooed at her as if she were a child for years, avoided her gaze, then sobbed and admitted she had been ordered to drug Isolde the night of the Marrow's initial visit if the girl became heartrending. "I thought it would spare you pain," the woman admitted, hands fluttering like trapped birds. "I thought it was mercy." The confession was both dagger and release. "How many lied to me?" Isolde asked, not even keeping the fury hidden now. "How much of me has been decided for me?" Victor's response was a cold calculus. "Everything," he said, "until you declare otherwise." The words collapsed the fragile truce Isolde had been building with herself and Cassian. She felt suddenly alone in a house filled with human voices and lycanthrope blood. Trust was a currency she could no longer spend. The walls she had let down, small windows of tenderness with Cassian, felt now like windows the Baron could look through and use to gauge where to strike. She turned on Cassian with the first rawness of someone in pain. "You brought me hope," she accused, voice thin with hurt. "You taught me to breathe and to want, and now what? You will defend me in words and then let me be offered again?" Cassian's face folded like a map. "I will not let them take you," he said, and there was a ferocity in him that cut against the exile's gentleness. "But I need you to understand your choices are more dangerous than you imagine." He was tired of being the gentle one in a house that demanded predators. "You tell me about danger when my father has been bartering me?" Her laugh broke like glass. "You say it as if you were naive." He reached for her then, not to soothe but to steady, and his hands trembled. "I am not naive." Their fracture was sharp and human, anger at betrayal, fear at the cost of love, an ache for autonomy complicated by the real politic of pack survival. They were not enemies then, but they were not wholly aligned either. The thing between them bent under the pressure of choices not yet made. While the household seethed, word of the exposed pact leaked beyond Blackridge's hedges like smoke on the wind. Spies are the undergrowth of the lichen world. All packs have them, feeding rumors to rivals and allies alike. The Morrow Alpha's envoy arrived sooner than expected, boots pounding like a storm across the manor stones. Their leader, a broad-shouldered wolf with a smile like a blade, carried eyes that read people like books they'd already decided to burn. He did not come to negotiate, he came to assess. "So the child is not as obliging as promised," he said, when Victor presented his guard and his practiced calm. The words were meant to belittle, but they carried a threat beneath them. Ownership of land, of blood, of people. The submission must be unambiguous. Isolde saw then the scale of the danger. The ritual the Baron had planned could be a ceremony of binding or a spectacle that marked Blackridge as weakened, ripe for Morrow's influence. Her father, confronted publicly, lost the little control he believed he had. He spoke of compromise and diplomacy. The envoy spoke of leverage and hunger. Cassian felt the room tilt into a dangerous orbit. He knew the Morrow's men were not bluffing when they talked of taking a borderland if Blackridge did not prove stable. He had witnessed how alliances are less about honor and more about advantage. The question of whether Isolde would be presented as a symbol had become a matter of survival for more than one family. That night, in the low hours before dawn, the fractures revealed themselves in private betrayals. A footman came to Cassian with a secret, one more drop in a bucket of treachery. "The Baron signed a clause," the boy said, voice shaking, If he cannot present Isolde, he must pay in land. Morrow wants soil, Beta. They will take the western ridge if the ceremony fails. Cassian's fists clenched until his palms hurt. The stakes were not just Isolde's life. They were Black Ridge's borderlands, the homes of hunters and the livelihoods of tenants. Victor's deal had been practiced men's work. Sacrifice one domesticated thing for 10 preserved assets. Isolde was not the only life balanced on that inked line. When Isolde heard it, her face hardened into something resolute that had not existed in the velvet-curtained girl she had been. She realized then that her choice would not only remake her body, it would remake the pack's map. The irony was bitter. The man who had caged her had also gambled with a people's home for his peace. She could accept the bargain and keep the peace, or she could refuse and watch the world reconfigure in war. The fracture between father and daughter widened into a canyon that night. Victor's rationales could not bridge the moral chasm that opened. Isolde's eyes, which had once been the house's measured blue, glowed with a dangerous brightness. "Then I will not be your pawn," she told him, her voice flat and inexorable. "You can give land to keep your alliances. You will not give me." Victor's answer was not immediate. His pride and his fear battled openly in front of his staff. When he finally spoke, his words had that cold clarity of a man who would rather break his child than break the law of his pack. "You will be presented," he said, "for the greater good." Cassian stepped between them like a blade, and history had taught him the law that went along with that position. "Then we stand and we fight," he said, "or we find another way." Isolde looked from her father to the Beta, who had become an axis point for her new desire, and something in her shifted, fierce as a tide. She had been preserved for a future that others had designed. Now she would be the one to choose whether preservation came at the cost of her freedom. The fractures in Black Ridge were not only political, they were the splitting of expectations, of old bargains undone and new loyalties born. The morrow had smelled weakness and come. The pack would find out soon whether strength would be measured by a ruler's tally of land or by the courage of those who refused to be counted. That night, under the watchful eyes of portraits and the hush of servants' rest, Isolde and Cassian made a plan that would either save them or destroy everything Victor had built. They did not speak of the moon's power or the exact ways they would fight. They spoke of small things: who could be trusted, where weapons might be hidden, which servants owed them debts they could call in. Their whispers were reticent strategy and a budding, urgent kind of love, one tempered by fear, braided with furious determination. When dawn came, it only made the fractures clearer. Black Ridge would not be mended by apologies. It would be carved anew by choices, by betrayals acknowledged, and by alliances forged in the open or in shadow. The truth, once set free, has a momentum of its own. Here, it hurt, cut, and made room for new shape. Isolde no longer wanted to be the pack's preserved heir. She wanted to be a woman who could howl her own claim into the world, consequences be damned. And Cassian, torn between exile's caution and a love that demanded action, prepared to follow her into whatever storm that choice would summon. They moved like conspirators at noon, when the house's pulses were busiest and eyes were easiest to mislead. Cassian drew up lists from memory. Men who had once owed him favors in Ironclaw, servants whose silence was bought by kindness, hunters loyal to land rather than lord. Isolde threaded through corridors with the arrogance of someone who had been taught to be small and had decided, in secret, she would not be so obedient any longer. Each plan she touched hardened into purpose. The Morrow delegation came a day early, boots stirring up the manor's gravel into angry eddies. They arrived with iron-smiled officers and a surgeon's appetite for advantage. Victor met them on the steps with the practiced calm of a man who had decided the world was negotiable. Isolde watched from a curtained window, her hands clenched on the sill until the wood surprised with a moan. She tasted fear and galvanized it into something like steel. When the envoy requested inspection, an obvious pretext, Victor's face lost the last of its softness. He invited them into the great hall, smiling a smile that had never been tender. Cassian stood at Isolde's back, a shadow with a purpose. He had refused to obey the Baron's command that he not involve himself. Obedience would have made him an accomplice. Instead, he had gathered allies in the night. 3 hunters from the Western Ridge who hated the idea of their valley becoming Morrow property. Marta with a ledger of Victor's signatures, and the steward who had been enough of a coward to speak truth in his fear. They stood now like a ragged cord, ready to be pulled. The Morrow's envoy was smooth and cruel. "We require demonstration," their leader said. His voice assumed the delicacy of a butcher choosing which joint to begin with. A proper acceptance. Victor folded his hands. "A ceremony will be held at moonrise," he said. "It will be formal and—" He was interrupted by a sound that shouldn't have belonged in a room of men like knives. Isolde's voice. "No," she said. The single syllable was not a plea or a negotiation. It was an unadorned refusal. It ricocheted in the hall and set the portrait's eyes to glittering. Victor's mouth hardened. "You will not be presented?" the envoy asked, mock-pitying. "I will not be given," Isolde answered. She rolled her chair forward with a motion that was more than ceremony. It was a claim. Every head in the hall turned like a chorus line hearing the opening chord to rebellion. "You asked to see me. Look, then, at the truth." Cassian's allies stepped forward. Hunters and servants, small men and tired women who would not be bought. Marta produced the packet with Victor's signatures, and the steward laid out the ledger of lands at risk. The room smelled suddenly of dust and old ink and the metallic tang of shame. The envoy laughed, a sound without warmth. "So you choose to defy the Baron? A spectacle indeed." At his signal, 2 of his guards reached for the door. The move was mechanical, practiced. It was meant to intimidate, but it only drew the line they had come to forge. Cassian met the guard's hands with steady fingers and a weight he had learned in exile. The knowledge that to protect someone you love means risking everything you've been given. "You will not take her as token," Cassian said. His voice was older than it should have been, threaded with the memory of snow and loss and the stubborn constancy of a man who had loved against law. "You will not take our land. Go back to your Alpha and tell him Blackridge will not barter its people." The Morrow's leader smiled and then lashed out. Steel and motion and an Alpha's entitlement. The skirmish was sudden and messy, boots on marble, a chair tipping, a servant swam into a statue. Marta screamed, and the steward shoved the ledger under his arm like a shield. Cassian moved as if he were one with the small, bright ferocity that had become Isolde's. He did not take the fight with hunger for pride. He fought to open a space for a woman to choose her own form. When the Morrow's leader lunged at Isolde, hands greedy like winter's clutch, Cassian stepped in and took the blow meant for her. The sound his body made when it hit stone was hollow and final. Blood opened at his temple like a dark flower. Isolde froze, time dividing into the instant before loss and the long after. The wolf in her did not hesitate. It was as if a bell had struck the marrow of her bones, and the long dormant maps of speed and dive and kill filled her like returning rain. She gripped the arms of her chair, the leather creaking, and the room held its breath. She did not transform into a thing for barter. She shifted into sovereignty. Muscles she had not known she owned knotted and rolled beneath her skin. She stood, fully, impossibly, Knees taking weight, spine realigning, the chair falling behind her like discarded law. Her hands were claws and hands both, moved with purpose and memory. In one motion, she threw herself between Cassian's fallen form and the man who had touched her like property. The Morrow officer stumbled as if struck by winter. Isolde's eyes were not wild with panic, they were bright with recognition. The wolf in her moved not for bloodlust. She pinned the envoy's wrist against the marble with a strength that made him cry out like a child. The room echoed with the primal, perfect sound of a howl. Isolde's howl, the note that stitched wolf and woman into a single, unrenounceable being. Victor watched as the ritual he had planned unraveled into something neither ceremony nor calculation could control. In the echo of that howl, he heard the theft he had engineered, and the sound knifed through him with a clarity that spared no vanity. He had tried to preserve a line and had nearly destroyed the lineage itself. Cassian lay cradled in the crook of a steward's arms, blood pooling against the weft of the floor. He met Isolde's eyes then, eyes that had been taught to be object and had become subject, and something like peace passed over him. "You came back," he mouthed, half laugh, half prayer. "I came to take you home," she said, voice ragged, as if each word had fought through sinew and bone to be born. She crawled toward him, shifting back and forth between forms with a grace that made the room ache. Her hands, soft, then hard, brushed his face. He tasted of iron and exile and the quiet of a world he had stepped out of to love. He smiled a brief falcon of a thing and folded his hand around hers. Blood slicked their palms together, and it was not only a wound, but a binding. The Morrow's men, seeing the fervor change the room into a thing they could not easily own, reeled back. The envoy's leader gathered his pride like a cloak and, with a final, dangerous promise, withdrew. "This is not finished," he said, voice like gravel. "You will pay." Isolde pressed her forehead to Cassian's and felt his breath hitch. She would pay, she knew. So would the Baron, who would have to reckon with the people he had tried to sell. But the immediate price had shifted. A beta had bled for a woman, and a woman had claimed her wolf in the middle of a hall full of witnesses. The morrow might come again, but they would come to a different threshold. Victor stood in the doorway, the severity of his face eroded by something like grief. He had seen his daughter take herself back and had watched his instrument, this exile he'd meant to parade, offer his blood. Power, he realized, with a sudden, dangerous clarity, could be sustained only by the consent of the living. Isolde lifted her head. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, touching her hair like silver wash. She could have been a portrait come to life, the preserved thing made human, claiming breath and consequence. She looked at her father with wolf-slow compassion and an unredeemable hurt. "You tried to keep me safe by making me small," she said. "You can learn another way, father. Or you can stand outside what remains." Victor's reply was a torn thing. He had built his life on certainty and now faced the unpredictability of his child's autonomy. He took a step toward them, toward the blood and the defiance, and the room stilled. Cassian raised his head a fraction, eyes bright with fever and triumph. He had been exiled for loving improperly, and here, in a hall where lineage and law had arranged futures like chess pieces, he had chosen instead to love so fiercely he bled. The cost might be exile renewed, might be the pack's wrath, but the gesture was absolute. He had given his body for a birth he could not legislate, the moment a woman decided to be whole. Isolde cupped his face, thumb tracing a line through coagulating blood. "Stay," she said. "I will fight for the pack. Fight beside me." He laughed, a wet, delighted sound. "I followed you into winter once," he said. "I will follow you into a war." Outside, the house had begun to stir as servants rushed to reckoning. Inside, amid the mess of blood and broken ceremony, a new allegiance took root, frail and ferocious both. Love, when it is forged in the grinding teeth of politics and the small bravery of two people who refuse to be possessions, does not arrive tidy. It arrives with sacrifice, with scars, and with a howl that rearranges the map. The morrow withdrew for now. The pack's borders would be argued over in private chambers and under moonlit trees in the weeks to come. But Blackridge had changed. Isolde's shift had been less a rescue than a revolution. A woman reclaimed, a beta who chose love over caution, and a baron whose final calculation would be whether to relearn what it is to hold power without breaking what is precious. The night settled with twice the breathing in the rooms it had before. Some